All right, here we're going to take a look at the Zagzebski question. So this is looking at a pretty new perspective in epistemology called virtue epistemology. This has different branches, but it largely came about as kind of a dissatisfaction with the whole post-Gettier epistemology literature. If you remember the Gettier reading that we had, that led to like literally decades of debates. And after a while, it seemed like they had kind of like gotten worn out a little bit. So, for whatever reason, at that kind of timing, maybe the time was right for Linda Zagzebski and Ernest Sosa to develop a new perspective that analyzes knowledge as a true belief that manifests intellectual virtues of the believer. On the other hand, if you manifest intellectual vices, no knowledge. So that would make the difference between having a true belief and having knowledge is that in knowledge, you have the true belief that comes about because of your exercise of intellectual abilities, intellectual skills, or intellectual virtues. Exactly what those turn out to be, these intellectual virtues, that's very much the kind of internal debate and question in the field, and there's lots of different approaches there. But they all kind of agree that that's what's going to make the difference between a true belief and knowledge, is that knowledge is the true belief which comes from that special source. Okay, so Zagzebski says that um, right off the bat, she gives like her analysis of knowledge. It's actually quite succinct, really, and direct. You can see she gives like four different bolded statements. The ones we looked at in the class, I think probably the easiest one to use for this is the third one, where she says that knowledge is a state of true belief that arises from the intellectual acts of intellectual virtue. So that tells us that true, knowledge is true belief plus intellectual virtue, roughly. Then she gives a pretty lengthy definition of what an active intellectual virtue is. So it's really critical that you see that those necessary conditions, the definition of acts of intellectual virtue, all of that's what's included in her definition of knowledge, because her definition of knowledge requires the active intellectual virtue. The active intellectual virtue turns out to be X, Y, and Z, so X, Y, and Z thus are necessary for knowledge. That's her view right there. So what you would do is kind of lay that out clearly, give a little like explanation in your own words of what these kind of official bolded definitions of hers seem to be getting at, like what's the kind of common sense way or just kind of other way we could describe this using her quotes, quote that there. Um, so one thing you might do is, you could compare that to, as opposed to Descartes. How does Zagzebski's view seem to differ from that? Or how does it differ from Goldman, for example, who we just read? Or how does it differ from some of the other epistemic theories of knowledge that we've been looking at? Or, you might just kind of comment on certain salient features of it, maybe emphasizing that clearly the intellectual virtues of the agent are a very important variable here, and that's kind of a new aspect of her theory. It remains to be seen if that's really going to stand up to its own presuppositions. So here's the thing that I would suggest, like as a way to give a nice thorough explanation of Zagzebski's analysis. So focus on the role of motivational states, because that is what's unique about her theory. Goldman doesn't. Descartes doesn't really seem to have that kind of emphasis either, but that's definitely distinctive about her view. So maybe have a little bit of a discussion of that particular part of her analysis of knowledge in terms of intellectual virtue, that now, because of that turn to the virtues, we now have motivational states as pretty central salient in the theory of knowledge, and that's kind of new and different. So what is this epistemic motivation, or motivation necessary for knowledge? So you might poke around in in her in the reading that we have from her, see what kinds of things you can get out from there that kind of give a characterization of what this new and potentially controversial necessary condition for knowledge is, motivations. So do that. The thing I would suggest, if you feel like you can do this, in class we looked at how Zagzebski's approach can give pretty good answers to these three, maybe even more, problems, quote unquote, that any good epistemic theory should be able to solve. At least that's the kind of going view, you might say, is that the right theory of knowledge, which all these people are trying to get, is going to have to at least answer the Gettier problem, one called the value problem that we looked at. There's also a thing called the generality problem. I spoke about that quickly. You can look that up if you want. The generality problem was developed by Fred Feldman, I think in the 80s. Oh yeah, so it might be enough if you could kind of say how it seems like Zagzebski's got a way to address Gettier problems. She talks about that right in her essay. And if you recall from class, how she also would address the value problem. What we discussed was that it's really the same thing that allows her to answer all of these problems seemingly pretty well, including the generality problem, namely the motivational states that are the unique characteristic of her view. It now looks like these are very useful features of her view. So this novel part of her view seems like a good thing, because now we seem like we've got straightforward answers to Gettier the following way. The people described in the Gettier cases quite clearly were not engaging in acts of intellectual virtue in the way that Zagzebski describes it. In part because their true belief did not arise from an act of intellectual virtue. The true belief arose from a lucky coincidence rather than their exercise of ability and skill. So that pretty clearly would suggest that the Gettier people, so to speak, the people in the Gettier example, wouldn't count as knowers on Zagzebski's view, because their true belief didn't arise from a state of intellectual virtue. And that's exactly the right answer. That's what you're supposed to say, is that the people in the Gettier cases don't have knowledge. The original problem arose for the JTB theory, justified true belief theory, because it looks like they would have to say that the Gettier people had knowledge, because they satisfied the JTB criteria for knowledge, but alas, they clearly don't have it, so you got the wrong criteria. It's fine if the Gettier people don't end up satisfying your criteria for knowledge, and it looks like Zagzebski's got a way to define them in such a way that they wouldn't. More straightforwardly, the motivational states also give a pretty easy way to address the value problem, in that we can say a true belief does not have to arise from a virtuous motivation. You can get a true belief from whatever means. Knowledge, however, must arise from a virtuous motivation. And virtuous motivations are good things, Zagzebski is going to say. In particular, the love of truth is a good thing. That's a good motivation to have because truth is a good thing. She argues that loving anything that's good is itself something good. Since truth is good, loving truth is good. Thus, if your motive is a motive of loving truth that motivates your inquiry and motivates your belief, then we can say that's a good making property of you, the agent, and that good making property of you, the agent, is part of what produces your knowledge. So that is something epistemically valuable in addition to the value of just the true belief alone. All this good stuff that comes from your praiseworthy or virtuous motivation provides an additional value separate from the value of true belief. That's what the value problem needs, or demands, we might say. And Zagzebski seems to give a pretty good way of answering that in praiseworthy motivations. Notice that Goldman really doesn't have any place in his theory for any necessary role for praiseworthy motivations. So he doesn't have that kind of epistemic value available to him to solve the value problem with. So there we can see like maybe a real advantage that Zagzebski's theory has in certain ways over Goldman's. So this is all kind of comparing Zagzebski and Goldman's, which you're welcome to bring in to the paper a bit if you want. She definitely had Goldman in mind when she was writing this in '96 and looking for theories that will kind of advance past that. Okay, so that's all Zagzebski, and it should be pretty much the bulk of this paper. I think a lot of that is getting into some of the nitty-gritty of her view and maybe kind of saying how she solves some of these problems. So then I ask here about, Brendel. So Elke Brendel has a nice paper that I've posted on iLearn, and she raises two different kinds of criticisms against two different forms of virtue epistemology. So this is really just asking you kind of about one strand in her overall paper. It's actually a really nice paper, and I think it would be well worth reading if you have the time. In particular, the early stuff on dispositions, I personally find very interesting. It's an important part of virtue epistemology. It's also a really new kind of hot field in philosophy. Kind of dispositions are back, kind of in popularity for whatever reason. I like it. But about halfway through, roughly, maybe a little sooner than half, she starts getting into these difficulties that face virtue epistemology. She mentions Zagzebski by name, and that's the kind of responsibilist wing of virtue epistemology. That's who Zagzebski is. So you really just want to follow up that where the problem is requiring motivation for knowledge. Clearly, we just saw how Zagzebski does that. And Brendel notes a potential problem with that move. That's exactly the move that looked pretty promising for Zagzebski, so that would be a problem. If epistemic motives turn out to somehow be problematic, then that's really kind of the central part of our view. That would be a big deal. So what's the problem that Brendel raises? It's pretty straightforward. In a way, it kind of harkens back to what Ryle was talking about and the kind of complaint of intellectualism. Really, Brendel has essentially the same type of complaint to raise of Zagzebski's theory of knowledge. Here, really, because of the overblown motivational requirements. I guess those are kind of intellectual requirements. Maybe they're something like that. But it's a kind of over-intellectualization. What you would say is that it's psychologically too demanding. It just demands too much psychological effort and doing to properly account for a wide area of our knowledge. Not all of it, But a good bit of our knowledge, Brendel argues, and many agree with her, comes to us pretty automatically, certainly without any overt, kind of direct, explicit, conscious motivation that we're following and thinking about when we form our beliefs. At least for ordinary beliefs that you just pick up during the day, like my keys are on the table, the cat is on the mat, the butter is in the fridge, today's Tuesday, these kinds of things, it's sunny out. Most of these beliefs that we get directly from perception are formed quickly, seemingly without any kind of conscious deliberation, where motives would be raised or would occur. So that right there is the problem, that the view is too narrow. It's too narrow of a definition of knowledge because it will only include in the category of knowledge those beliefs that arise from motivations. But it looks like lots of beliefs that should count as knowledge, like the stuff right in front of your eyes and the beliefs that you form on that basis, they should count as knowledge, but they don't have any motivation that gives rise to them. It just happens. You look and you see and you form a belief, and it's a pretty reliable, to use Goldman's expression, reliable way to go. And a lot of our knowledge comes from there. If none of that stuff's going to count as knowledge because it's not motivated, which looks like it would be Zagzebski's view, then that's a quite narrow definition of knowledge, and maybe just a bad one if it leaves out so many things that clearly are knowledge from so counting. Okay, so hopefully you get the view there. It's really just a way of kind of putting that it's a too narrow of a definition. Lots of things are knowledge that won't satisfy that definition. So that's a pretty good, I think it's a pretty good argument, and it does raise interesting kind of psychological questions about how much psychologically complex processing goes into ordinary knowledge that we acquire throughout the day. So I have here then, consider some way that Zagzebski could respond to Brendel's objection. So there, she's got this discussion of high-grade and low-grade knowledge. That's right in the reading. So that's pretty much her way of seeing that, she can tell that some knowledge is low-grade knowledge and it's more automatic processing, perception, memory, basic inference, stuff like that. So maybe that's a sufficient response that she's got to Brendel's objection. Another one that Linda doesn't do but she could do is by saying that there's a kind of less intellectualized, kind of more simplified way of interpreting what a motivation is. For example, maybe a motivation is just like a straight desire rather than like a plan. Plan is a lot more complicated thing than just a sheer desire. So maybe she could say we're motivated to form true beliefs in the way that we just kind of have desires for things. And that's something, we can have desires for things without cooking up a big motivation or plan. So maybe I should say really, maybe that we could say that counts as a kind of a simpler type of motivation. A more complex type of motivation would be a full intentional plan. And if we say that she can include desires as motivations, then maybe desires do have some role in these kind of basic forming of true beliefs from perception. Even if full-on planning doesn't. Our desires kind of make our eyes kind of look where they do and form beliefs at what we're looking at because of what our interest and what we're desiring. So that's a different kind of response. I kind of favor that myself, just in that I think it raises interesting questions, and I've kind of done some things that are in that direction. Okay, so I think that's most of the story for that one. All right.